how do you put the idea of a Green Deal in context of India, where things seems to be going bad for multiple communities? The current government policy doesn't seem to be moving towards sustainability or social justice. For example, just the new farmer bill.
Yeah, thanks, Pragati. Certainly in India, it seems like a pretty bad situation, or probably half or more than half the world. And there's been a lot of attempts to try and bring social movements and ecological movements together across the country, different kinds of movements, no movements for women's rights, for the rights of farmers, for more ecological sanity, youth movements, etc., to be able to raise a more collective voice against the kind of neo-fascist decisions that our government in India is taking. Um, Civil society is strong in India, and despite the worsening situation, I'm at least hopeful that having been through 300, 400 years of civil society resistance and the continued creation of alternatives, that we will be able to see through this mess. I think two things are important here, at least. One, like I said, resistance, continued resistance, speaking up, speaking truth to power, what Gandhi called satyagraha. But secondly, also continuing to both practice and dream and envision what the alternative society would look like. Supposing, for instance, we're able to defeat this government in the next elections or whatever, it's not necessary that the next government coming in will be significantly better. And that's why the need to envision and practice on the ground the kind of radical alternatives that I'm talking about. So much more networking of these alternatives, much more collective visioning, etc. We have a process in India called the Vikalp Sangam, which means alternatives confluence. It's a process of bringing a lot of movements together, and it's through that and many others that we're trying to create some sort of an atmosphere, including and especially amongst young people. As you probably know, we had our own, what I would call the Indian environmental George Floyd moment, when this government proposed the new environmental impact assessment notification, which was a horrible, horrible new legislation that would make it much easier for destructive projects to be given permission. And a lot of opposition came from the youth. I think 200,000, 300,000 people, young people, actually raised their voices. So to me, that's a hopeful sign that we can continue resisting and building these alternatives for a rainbow New Deal, not a Green New Deal only. Thanks.
Okay. Len has a question himself. You want to just pose it yourself? I think that makes more sense.
Yeah. I would be really interested, Ashish, like what I see in your presentation a lot is that you don't see such a strong role for the state, while a lot of mobilizations here in Europe, here in Germany, where I am based, are focused on demands that are put to the government with this idea of wartime mobilization. This is the language that is often used. A government that really makes short-term changes in the next 2 years or 5 years. Do you see a role for this at all, or do you think that demands to the state government or the EU government, if you want, are inherently flawed?
I think if we put most of our eggs in that basket, we're not going to get very far. I've seen very few governments in the world actually being progressive in any holistic sense. So, okay, some are better than others, and certainly many would be better than Mr. Modi here and Mr. Trump in the US. But they'll be better at a somewhat marginal level. They might be better in terms of somewhat greener policies, more renewable energy, more welfare, such as in many countries in Europe, and that's important. I don't want to belittle that. I think that's important. So we do have to struggle for who is in power to change, but in the long run, these are not solutions. The nation states of the world have known about the climate crisis for the last 20, 30 years, and virtually nothing has been done. The United Nations has been so significantly weakened that it is not a forum for any fundamental changes anymore. And so I think simultaneously, and I would myself put much more energy into energizing, networking, helping, supporting, and expressing solidarity with grassroots movements. As I said, both for practical and for conceptual, visionary transformation. So I'm not denying the need to address the state, but I think if we only or mostly do that, and if, as the left has, unfortunately, the orthodox left has mostly done, is to say let's capture the state and then we'll transform society. We don't see that happening anywhere, whether it's Greece or you see Venezuela or you see Bolivia or you see Ecuador, and many others. I didn't see that the revolutionary left parties had fundamentally transformed the centralization of power or the way the economy is run. It's still very extractivist, still very oil based, etc.
Can I add to that? So, picking off where Ashish left, here in California, what we're noticing is that when we demand the central government, which is the federal government, yes, we put some pressure on them, but it's better to go to your local governments, the local city councils, go to the meetings, attend these meetings, build like he mentioned, build solidarity with the local groups. But then when we do this, what we've also noticed that there's only so much that the local government can do for us. It all depends on budget. Do they have the budget to provide you for the project that you want to do? Do they? And we're always shut down. But also in recent years, California has been doing a lot in terms of leading the way in being much greener and more introducing more environmental friendly legislation. And we are an example for other states. And I know that California, the mayor of Los Angeles actually introduced the Green New Deal. It's not as ambitious as the Green New Deal AOC or Bernie Sanders would like to see. And the Sunrise Movement is constantly criticizing the Green New Deal and putting pressure on local cities and mayors to change the Green New Deal, to input more community engagement in there, because community engagement at the end of the day is important. It's the communities that understand what they need in terms of climate change action, in terms of disaster preparedness. So focus on community engagement, build solidarity with grassroots movements, and put pressure on your local governments, local council, go to local council meetings, always show up. I think that's a key thing to achieving success.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree, Nasreen. And I think the other thing is to also build solidarity across these local governments, so that some local governments, for instance, in California, might be let's say fund surplus, or at least they have the ability to generate more funds than say somewhere else in the US, which is a much poorer kind of thing. So if one can, instead of depending on the central government for the funds, if you can actually build this kind of cross solidarity also between countries, not just within, then I mean, let's take Amsterdam. Amsterdam has decided that they're going to try and apply Kate Raworth's donut economy. I don't know, many of you know about the donut economics model, which essentially says you can't, there is a sustainable limit of production and consumption and so on, and then there's also the absolute minimum that everybody needs to have. And so that's the inner circle of the donut, and then the outer circle. And so they've said that. Now Amsterdam is a city which actually has a lot of resources. So suppose my city, Pune, says, okay, and we're able to push our municipality into trying something similar. Maybe Amsterdam and Pune can have a partnership in which some resources that are needed come from Amsterdam. So you're actually cutting across nation states also. It's not easy. These are all difficult things to do. But we'll have to think of these sorts of innovative, creative ways of mobilizing resources.
Thank you. Sabrina had a question about Canada specifically. Do you maybe want to just pose it yourself? You can give a bit more background.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. So I'm on the east coast of Canada, where there's a large Indigenous territory called Mi'kmaq territory, which was never ceded under any treaties or anything like that. And so Indigenous sovereignty is like a large part of conversations in the climate movement. And so I don't know if you've heard of the land back movement, but that's a big one that's happening in Canada right now. So Indigenous people yeah, really centering like we should have control over our land, which is largely within Canada unceded territory. And so I'm just kind of wondering, how do you both ask for the government to do action on climate while also recognizing that the government isn't really legitimate for a lot of people that are within the climate movement, if that makes sense?
Nasreen, do you want to start?
Yeah. So in terms of putting pressure on the government, from my personal experience working with the local government commission, we do a lot of studies. We do a lot of community outreach and talk with the local communities that we are representing. We get their opinion. So there's like monthly meetings with them to see what are their demands, what do they want. And then we go on behalf of them and propose that to the local city council meeting, whichever city that we're working on. And when you keep doing it repetitively, you keep showing up to these meetings, like determinants and perseverance, sends a message to them. Like, look, they've done their research. They're not coming to us empty-handed. They have facts, that we need to make this a priority. Like when we were getting the mayor of LA to declare a climate emergency, you saw that the Sunrise Movement, they went out in masses. They went out in hordes and stood outside of Mayor Garcetti's house, demonstrating, protesting, going outside of the city hall, you know, and demanding. You just, like I said, mobilization, mobilization, mobilization. But before you mobilize, make sure you have your facts to present to them why you are asking for this. And it will be really interesting. I don't know how transparent Canada is in terms of their budgets for the different government commissions that they have, to research their budget, where most of the money is going. And you can call them out on the spot, be like, hey, you have this fund and you are using it for the wrong reasons. You could divert this and use this for something that is going to be beneficial for the whole society, such as like climate change and environmental action. Ashish, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nasreen, and thanks, Sabrina, for the question. Well, I mean, I don't, of course, understand or know the Canada situation so well, but I have been following some of the indigenous, the First Nations and the Canadian indigenous peoples' struggles, especially the Wet'suwet'en, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. We actually are in a, right, we're in a global consortium called the ICCA Consortium, or the Territories of Life, in which I think they're also a member. And so I've been following some of the struggles against the pipeline and other destructive projects. I think, again, two things here are important, apart from what Nasreen has said. One, the more we have such struggles for self-determination or independent, autonomous functioning within nation states, and challenging the hegemony or the power of the nation state, especially in indigenous territories, but also in other places where communities have traditionally lived for hundreds of thousands of years. The more we're able to challenge policies that also create or enhance the climate crisis or the biodiversity loss crisis, right? So for instance, challenging the pipeline is a fundamental way of actually saying that this is not the form of development we want. This is not, because it leads to displacement, dispossession, and to climate crisis and biodiversity loss. So one is that it shows the rest of the world. We were very inspired, for instance, when some of the pipelines were stopped, or we were inspired when the Standing Rock movement happened all the way in India, even though it was happening across the world, because we felt that here was, and by we I mean also the Indian indigenous people and communities, that if a community could stand up against the might of the fossil fuel industry and the might of the nation state, as powerful as the United States and Canada, why can't we all do it here? You know, so in that sense, it's a very powerful way of increasing resistance. But the second thing is that if the same First Nations or indigenous peoples or other communities are able to show that we also can live a different way of life, that we know if this form of development is wrong, for us, this is the form of well-being that meets our needs and aspirations without destroying the earth and without creating huge inequalities and without depriving somebody else. So it seems to me that the more, for instance, Canadian First Nations can do something like that, and show that even young people who aspire to modern ways of life can also actually, I read one article which said that young people who, because of the pandemic, actually went back to the communities in some of the First Nations, are learning how to live off the land from the elders. Now, if we can figure out these hybrid systems in which today's youth are reconnecting to their cultural roots and ecological roots and knowledge roots, but also living in some senses a part of the modern world, like using cell phones or whatever in some way. These are uncomfortable hybrids, but this is what I think young people are doing, and may get excited by doing that. It shows that there's another way to also live, and that I think is also a powerful way of telling the government that yours is not the only way to do things. It's creating problems. Here's an alternative. And then some state governments might listen, some municipalities might listen, and eventually maybe some central governments will also listen. And as they don't, or if they don't, we expand the territories of autonomy more and more and more, and create zones where we live in the way we want, like the Zapatista in Mexico. They don't recognize the Mexican state, and for the last 30, 40 years, they've lived in the way that they want, though they continue to be threatened by the Mexican state, and there's violence against them all the time. Or the Kurdish Rojava movement in Central Asia, in the midst of the world's most war-torn region, no? Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and they're trying to create a zone of radical democracy, eco-feminist, peaceful existence. So one can be inspired by that and say, okay, maybe I should try that out in our region also. So I think it's this combination that would be really crucial, where you really challenge the economic models and the political models that are creating the climate crisis in the first place.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd also have a question. If I'm not seeing any other questions, please just put them in the chat and we can come to you as well. So I was wondering, like, the topic of this workshop is a global Green New Deal, but I think our understanding of it is more like, we're not talking about a global, like a multilateral treaty with all states, but more like Green New Deals in specific countries with all the important global dimensions. So I would just like to ask you, if you would think about a sort of checklist or something like that to have a truly global Green New Deal in different countries, what would that include for you? What would be the most important parts?
Sorry, just to understand the question again, if one was to think of a global Green New Deal in each of our countries, or at a global level?
No, so basically it's not this notion that there's an international global Green New Deal, but that each state has a Green New Deal, but that is global in itself because it
Okay.
has the considerations of it.
So I think, Chiara, it's going to be very difficult for each country, in the way our countries are formed right now, to by itself have a deal that is also global in nature. I'll tell you why. See, with economic globalization in the last 30, 40 years, each of our economies has become so intricately intertwined with the global economy that it's simply not possible. For instance, suppose India got a fantastic new government which says, we want to become completely self-reliant. I think for a lot of things, India could be, because India is large and it has the resources. But a lot of countries simply don't have that kind of wherewithal. So if they're heavily dependent, for instance, on selling, I don't know, coffee or oil or something to Europe, and tomorrow we say that that country should actually have a Green New Deal, which is also globally relevant, it won't be possible unless the trade relations with Europe also change dramatically. So this is where a global Green New Deal also has to be global. It can't just be at a national level in the current way in which nation states are formed. However, there are certainly things that can be done. And I think here, especially the responsibility of the global north is very, very crucial. So if the US really wants a global Green New Deal, it will have to do a couple of things that I mentioned earlier, especially challenge its own internal consumption patterns. So to say that, okay, we will become self-reliant in, let's say, energy, with clean, renewable sources of energy, but at the same time, we will challenge our standards of living, which require immense amounts of energy. Yeah, which means degrowth. So this is why it's becoming a relatively popular movement in Europe, among some civil society and academics and so on, at least. And I think some governments are beginning to think about it, is that you have to significantly scale down material and energy consumption if you want to be globally responsible. Because a global Green New Deal or global Rainbow Deal is also about responsibility to the globe. And you can't do that at levels of consumption that you have, whether you're in Scandinavia or you're in the US or you're in Japan or wherever. Right? And unfortunately, even India and China now, because we are also now colonizing other places in other countries. China is colonizing parts of Africa, Latin America, India is doing it in Africa. And because we have new economic might, we are able to go and actually exploit resources in some other peoples and some other countries' lands. So I think the global North needs to have, if it's a global Green New Deal, to me, the most important part of that would actually be responsibility towards the globe, which means then you look at your own production and consumption patterns. For the South, for the global South, it would be, I think, first and foremost to see a fairly radical reassessment of what are the internal resources available to us, which can be used for at least some level of self-reliance. Okay, so for instance, what Cuba did when the sanctions hit them in the 60s and 70s and so on, they said, okay, let's, at least for agriculture, for food, can we be completely self-reliant? And they moved to a very different model of agriculture than would have happened if they were connected to the global system in some way. Havana decided that it would produce most of its food within the city, which is very remarkable, right? You have urban agriculture on a huge scale. So that would mean rethinking the way one uses land, the way one uses forests, the way one uses economic resources, the way one uses our skills. So again, let's take India and many other countries. We have skills to produce virtually everything by hand. By everything, I mean everything that's in for daily use. No, our clothes that we wear, the footwear that we use, the soap that we use. So items of daily consumption in our homes, for instance, are possible to be produced at a small scale by producers, largely handmade, which would do two things. One, it would be ecologically much more sustainable. Secondly, it would create enormous employment opportunities compared to the large industrial mechanized forms of production. I don't mean everything can be produced like that, but most things can be. So we need to take a decision saying, okay, a Green New Deal or a Rainbow New Deal would be, first and foremost, prioritize the livelihoods of those who are able to produce all these items of daily consumption, including food, energy, clothes, water, footwear, soaps, etc., etc. And you will find that actually then you can have significant self-reliance, which also makes you responsible to the globe, to yourself, your own populations, but also to the globe. The big, I'm sorry, this answer is longer than it should have been. The big elephant in the room, so to speak, not to insult elephants, but the big elephant in the room here is militarization. If India continues to have an aggressive relationship with Pakistan, for instance, and China, and vice versa, so much of the resources are going into just keeping the military up, that we then don't have those resources freed up to put into what we need. And this is true for virtually every country in the world, except one or two that don't keep an army. So again, a global Green New Deal has to also be about demilitarization, because then countries are so much more able to actually use the resources that they have internally for the real needs of people and for protecting nature. So it's complex. There's no way in which a single country can do this on its own without some of these larger complex issues also being simultaneously challenged.